He advocated for a balanced, natural food diet, including all food groups, but like a lot of people mid-century, a lot of milk. He died of a blood clot 2 days after surgery at 74.
And I'd be interested to know what brought about that decision, or how long have you been a vegetarian, or would you talk about that?
Sure. From the time that my father died, I haven't had meat in my diet. And that was in 1970. And then a few years ago, I gave up seafood. And that was simply because I said to somebody, I had heard that fish was very good for you. And that person said, yeah, but it's not good for the fish. I hadn't thought of that.
Mr. Rogers was co-owner of Vegetarian Times, but was very respectful of people who had other diets. He died of stomach cancer at 74. Carl Momberg was the editor of Health and Hygiene magazine, and in 1935 he wrote a book called Diet and Die about fad diets. The number 3 diet on his list? Vegetarianism. How far vegetarianism had fallen since the age of Sylvester Graham and John Harvey Kellogg. He died at 75. Barry Groves believed most of what the experts have told us about nutrition is wrong and we're designed to eat meat. He wrote several books such as Eat Fat, Get Thin. He died at 77 of a heart attack. What? You've never heard of Barry Groves? At this point, you're probably asking who's making his list and who isn't and why. I can best answer that by skipping ahead to a chick, Dr. Harriet Chick. I'm not making that up, and now you won't forget her name. She had the audacity to apply as a researcher at the prestigious Lister Institute in London, where no men had been hired before. Over the objection of some of the men, the director gave her a chance, and here she is among a sea of men in suits. Did I offend you by calling her a chick? Then can I call her a dame? Because that's what Queen Elizabeth called her when she made her Dame of the British Empire. Here's how it happened. When World War I broke out, the men of Lister got deployed overseas, and the director wrote from a field hospital to Harriet, asking her to research what could be added to the troops' rations to prevent the outbreaks of beriberi and scurvy that they were seeing. Dr. Chick organized a small group of women who figured out that milk and cheese didn't help, but whole grains prevented beriberi, and the most practical solution to scurvy was sprouted beans. After the war, the big cities of Europe and North America were grappling with rickets among the children, and it was very confusing. Was it an infectious disease like tuberculosis due to unsanitary crowding? Many experts had come to think so. Swedish fishermen had used cod liver oil as a folk remedy, but Scottish researchers had shown that you could cure puppies of rickets by taking them out on walks in the fresh air. So it couldn't be a nutritional disease. So Harriet spent 2 years in a Vienna hospital testing infants with rickets and showed conclusively that you could bring them back to health with several different fish liver oils, butter, summer sun, or even ultraviolet lamps. Untangling the chemicals behind beriberi, scurvy, and rickets led to a whole series of Nobel Prizes from people you've probably never heard of. Harriet went on to found the British Nutrition Society and serve as its first president. She last spoke there when she was 98, was seen taking the London Underground by herself at 99, and lived to 102. Her life helped me put so many nutrition mysteries into context. First, how did dairy become so associated with health among Northern Europeans and Americans? That's partly because a strange new vegetable arrived from the Andes of all places in the late 1500s. It thrived in cooler climes and displaced many fields of grain. Potatoes have vitamin C to prevent scurvy, which grains don't. Potatoes provided 3 to 4 times the calories per acre than grain, and you didn't need milling machines. And marauding troops couldn't steal all your food like they could the grain because potatoes are in the ground. What else was needed for a thriving peasant population? Dairy, because it had vitamins A, D, and B12, which potatoes were missing. Context is everything, and in the context of the day, potatoes and dairy were superfoods. Second, it helped me understand why my mom and grandmother, both organic chemists, made me take a spoonful of cod liver oil every day and thought milk and butter were so healthy. It was centuries of accumulated wisdom, and the fact that B12 was one of the last vitamins to be discovered and wasn't manufactured until the 40s. And third, why does nutritional science have such a dodgy reputation? I think it's because great scientists are not the people we're listening to. We're listening to book authors who write books with sensational titles. I'm going to put Dr. Chick on my timeline anyway and get back to the people we are listening to. Fortunately, there are some great scientists and doctors in the crazy mix of it all. Speaking of sensational titles, the Gersons. Dr. Max Gerson became famous for a therapy program that the Gerson Institute claims has a high degree of success curing heart disease, diabetes, and both famously and controversially, cancer. It involves a vegan diet, many glasses of fresh squeezed juice a day because they believe juice concentrates the nutrients and makes them easier to absorb. Frequent coffee enemas, they even sell an enema kit. Max Gerson died at 77, and the official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but the internet says he may have died of arsenic poisoning by the medical mafia. Weston Price was a very special dentist who traveled the world in the 30s to study the effect of processed foods on native populations. He took awesome photos of their teeth and even sent native foods back to the US to analyze for its nutritional content. He discovered what we all now know, that processed food is the devil. One very confusing thing is pricepottinger.org, which dates back to 1952 and is filled with articles like eating a rainbow and avoiding the carnivore diet, gets confused with the Weston A. Price Foundation, which was established a half-century after he died, and whose imagery is all about animal foods, and it has an appalling legacy. Dr. Price died in 1948 at 77. And now on to a crazy kook who wrote a book with a sensational title, Herman Thaler, who sold 2 million copies in 1961. He claimed the safflower oil pills he sold caused you to lose weight by softening your fat tissues, and that's one of the reasons he was convicted of fraud. He died at 78. 3 years before him, Richard McCarness published a similar low-carb book that sold well. That's been a reliable formula for weight loss books for 2 centuries. He died at 79 of a stroke. Roy Walford was an expert on life extension through calorie restriction, believing we could live to 120. He famously was the doctor for an 8-person crew who lived in Biosphere 2 for 2 years. There's a great recent movie about that. He was a respected professor at UCLA Medical School and died of Lou Gehrig's disease at 79. Charles Atlas was one of the most famous men in the world in his day, and he had a backstory every young man could identify with. He took his girlfriend to the beach, and a bully kicked sand in his face and embarrassed him in front of his girl. He invented a technique to get a world-class physique without a gym, so you too could get a body like his.
Aw, honey, you still have enough muscle, but there is the issue of the hair, like bait and switch.
Charles drank a lot of milk, always with fruit, but otherwise he had a pretty balanced diet. According to his son, Charles developed diabetes in his 70s, so his doctors put him on a low-carb diet, which clogged his arteries, and he had a heart attack at 80. Paul Bragg was a force of nature whom Jack LaLanne claims saved his health as a teen and set him on a career path. Paul and his adopted daughter Patricia have sold healthy living products for 100 years, and 91-year-old Patricia recently sold their company to her neighbor Katy Perry.
I called her God's song. I paid for singing lessons from the age of 8 on. At 12, I bought her a guitar.
Cauliflower. Keto.
Paul was known to exaggerate his age, but apparently he was 81 when he died of a heart attack while swimming. William Banting is famous as the father of low-carb diets. He was a portly undertaker whose doctor advised him at age 65 to give up milk, butter, bread, sugar, and beer. He said he'd tried everything to lose weight, but admitted he'd been very fond of buttered bread and pastries. He wrote a thin pamphlet in 1863, A Letter on Corpulence, addressed to the public. He went from 202 pounds at 5 feet 5 inches tall to 150 a couple of years later. His new diet had plenty of meat, a little dry bread and boiled rice, some fruit, green vegetables, and wine. So how did Banting become the father of low-carb diets when Dr. Rollo had written about it long before and doctors were using it to treat diabetes patients? Malcolm Gladwell once explained that the really popular diet books usually have 3 things in common. 1, the author was trapped in darkness, unable to lose weight or get well. 2, they discovered a secret that had been overlooked, ignored, or repressed. And 3, they advocate a plan that works fast without too much sacrifice. I'd add a 4th one, which is to add the words new and revolutionary. To his great credit, though, Banting lost a lot of weight on his new diet and made it another 16 years to 81.
The Salisbury steak actually has its beginnings as a proposed cure for digestive illnesses during the Civil War. Far from the nuisance it is in the U.S. today, digestive illnesses killed more soldiers during the Civil War than combat did. The inventor of the Salisbury steak, Dr. James Henry Salisbury, born near Portland, New York, was an early pioneer of germ theory and of diet being a factor in health.
He published a carnivore diet book using words I had to keep looking up as I read it. He lived to 82. Do you know where you heard Inuits are healthy on an almost all-meat diet? Probably from Vilhjalmur Stefansson, the Arctic explorer, advocate of an all-meat diet, and Harvard professor.
Stephenson has also been given up for dead. In fact, Stephenson and his two companions are very much alive.
He wrote fantastic books on Arctic exploration and a book called Fat of the Land, which advocated a plant-free diet.
I have since then spent aggregated more than 6 years on red meat. That is seal meat, caribou meat, muskox meat, polar bear, grizzly bear, and so on. You have to have fat with a lean. Lean and fat together make a perfect diet.
He died at 82.
You know, he told me how much in the black community Dr. Sebi is revered.
Absolutely.
As an elder.
They brought us over here and didn't bring our diet with us.
That if your ancestors are from Africa, your body is not programmed to digest milk.
How I found out that black people should be vegetarians, because when I begin to remove you from that meat and that stuff, that grease, you begin to say in 1 week of the pain that you had for years begin to disappear.
Tragically, he died in a Honduran prison of pneumonia at 82. Dennis Burkitt received tons of honors as a great scientist and surgeon, and he devoted decades to medical mercy in Africa. Hero. One of the things he was famous for was discovering the role of fiber in preventing constipation and other diseases. He died of a stroke at 82. Here's a sensational title for you. Raymond Francis was a chemist and a New York Times best-selling author who recommended a diet as close to whole plants as you could get. But he had very little respect for doctors.
This is the level of ignorance that we teach in our medical schools.
And he thought vaccinations destroyed health. He died at 83, and they didn't release the cause of death, but it was near the height of the COVID pandemic in America, and I couldn't help wondering if he thought his diet would prevent that too. Ephraim Cutter was a Harvard-educated doctor with over 400 publications, and he wrote a low-carb diet book in 1908. He was very critical of vegetarianism. He said beef has cured grave chronic diseases when vegetable food had brought them on. He published a paper on diet and cancer where he prescribed a strict animal diet to patients, but if you must eat a mixed diet, do it sparingly. He lived to 84.
70-year-old Bernard McFadden, publisher and physical culture advocate, who learned flying at 65, enters the Bendix Transcontinental Speed Races.
People are surprised that I should want to enter this Bendix race, a man of my age. But one reason for entering it is to make a demonstration. His life really begins at 70. Some people say it begins at 40 or 50, but I'm inclined to believe it begins at 70.
Bernard McFadden was a publicity-seeking force of nature if ever there was one.
Meanwhile, America's grand old man Bernard McFadden takes to the air to celebrate his 83rd birthday. Not content with being airborne when most men are chairborne, Bernard decides to return to Earth the hard way by parachute.
He was America's godfather of fitness who recommended a mostly whole food vegetarian diet with a little meat and milk. He didn't have any faith in doctors, and he died of a urinary tract infection at 87 after refusing treatment.
Summoned to the hospital for an emergency consultation, a famed Boston heart specialist, Dr. Paul Dudley White, declared prospects were reasonably good for the president's complete recovery.
Paul Dudley White was the father of cardiology with a giant reputation and Eisenhower's cardiologist. He wrote 12 books and more than 700 papers.
I suppose that the truth rests somewhere between the viewpoints of individuals who are vigorous in their advice to beware of all fats, and those of others who go to the opposite extreme in their advice to pay little or no attention to the fat content of diets, or even to advocate high contents of fat, as does the explorer, Stephenson.
He died at 87 of a stroke.
Here is the kickoff of one of the most exciting football games of all time, as Princeton, with stripes on sleeves, kicks to Yale, wearing white helmets, and Clint Frank starts the game with a spectacular run back.
The father of American biochemistry, Russell Chittenden, was a very distinguished professor at Yale, widely quoted in the day, who did experiments on military men and athletes in the early 1900s to see what happens to physical performance on a lower protein diet. His studies showed they improved. He published a book in 1907, The Nutrition of Man, advocating a lower protein diet. He died at 87. Michio Kushi was a huge force in promoting the macrobiotic diet, largely plant-based, and wrote the Cancer Prevention Diet book. He died at 88 of pancreatic cancer.
Minute Maid Fresh Frozen Orange Juice brings you Gaylord Hauser, renowned author of the bestseller Look Younger, Live Longer, the book on diet and health that has swept the world.
Gaylord Hauser was the dashingly handsome nutritionist to stars like Greta Garbo and, according to Maclean's, had perhaps 20 million readers of his book. He recommended whole natural foods like vegetables and lean meats and fortifying them with skim milk, brewer's yeast, and blackstrap molasses, which he called the wonder foods. He died at 89 of pneumonia. Martin Catan sold millions of copies of his books in the 80s, which focused on fruit and vegetables and keeping fat below 20% of calories. He died at 90 after a long illness. I couldn't put Upton Sinclair's book on fasting down. He was a world-class writer who penned the famous line, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." He had access to all the famous influencers of his day. The vegetarian John Harvey Kellogg, the distinguished meat advocate Dr. Salisbury, the physical specimen Bernard McFadden, and the famous biochemist Dr. Chittenden. Reading this book was like watching a famous Hollywood movie when you had only seen the remake, which was made 50 years after the original. In the modern version of this book, the journalist Michael Pollan plays the role of Upton Sinclair. Eat mostly plants, but a little meat won't hurt you. Arnold Schwarzenegger plays the role of Bernard McFadden. Back off on the meat, you don't need it to be a man. Dr. Atkins plays the role of Dr. Salisbury by writing popular low-carb books. Professor Colin Campbell plays the role of Professor Chittenden by warning too much protein is toxic. Upton Sinclair died at 90. Speaking of believing too much protein is toxic, Joe Weider. He's considered the father of bodybuilding, the creator of Olympia contests, magazines like Muscle and Fitness, and the protege of Arnold. Joe's nutrition philosophy was protein gives you muscle, carbs give you energy, and you don't need much fat. Too much protein is toxic, and carbs should be whole, like fruits and vegetables. He lived to 93, getting up there. Jay Kordich was the author of best-selling books about juicing and known as the Juice Man. He lived to 93. Linus Pauling was the celebrated chemist who won 2 Nobel Prizes and believed in megadoses of vitamins. He believed in a balanced diet, avoiding sugar, refined grains, and saturated fat. He died at 93 of prostate cancer. Charlotte Gerson carried on the tradition of her father Max with the Gerson therapy, a vegan diet with coffee enemas. She lived to 96. Harold Shryock was the dean of Loma Linda's Medical School and the author of many wonderful books. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, so no meat, alcohol, or smoking, but he did think milk was healthy. He lived to 97. Norman Walker was a juicing pioneer who wrote tons of best-selling books in the mid-1900s, which are still popular on Amazon today. He died at 99. You know how when a crisis happens, you get a look behind the curtain and find heroes you never knew about? We consumers see books with sensational titles, but what about medical professionals who have to deal with serious disease? They have to turn to something much more substantial. Oh, I need Charles Atlas's arms. We can all be thankful there are people like Maurice Schills who somehow organize the world's experts to produce mind-blowing reference works like this. I don't know what Maurice ate, but if it's what's reflected in these thousands of pages, it would have been a whole lot of plants and not much processed food or red meat. He lived to 100. We already talked about the great Harriet Chick, so I'll move on to the great Joe Rolino. He was a strongman performer at Coney Island in the 20s and 30s before heading off to World War II in the Pacific Theater. It was brutal, and he came home with 3 Purple Hearts, a silver and a gold star, and shrapnel in his leg and neck. But at 104, he was still walking 5 miles a day, come rain or shine, working out at the gym 5 days a week, and swimming in the Atlantic Ocean 3. On his 103rd birthday, he entertained the guests by bending quarters like this. Maybe not. At 104, he blew out the candles on his birthday cake, but he passed on a slice of cake because he said, you don't get to 104 and eat that.
How old are you, Joe? I'm 104 years of age. We used to lift the dumbbells in New York, Pennsylvania, still today, in Pennsylvania. It weighs 2,130 pounds. I used to lift that 75 times consecutive repetitions. Of course, back then in the vaudeville age of the 20s, being a strongman was a very big thing. It was a red thing. It was incomparable to other people. Like, people can go to the movies. They could come to Coney Island and see the strongest man in the world.
He gave up meat at age 20 and a variety of dairy foods, whatever that means. He died at 104 out on one of his walks when he got run over by a car.
Aish was born in a remote village of Dhamti in Kamila district in Bengal. He was crowned Mr. Universe in 1952. He is a three-time Asian Games gold medalist in bodybuilding. The secret of his health is a simple diet of milk, fruits and vegetables along with rice, lentils and fish. He does not smoke and never touched alcohol.
He too lived to 104. Let's hear it for old school bodybuilders. Shigeaki Hinohara was a Japanese longevity expert who lived to 105. For breakfast, he had a glass of milk and a glass of orange juice with a tablespoon of olive oil in it. He would often skip lunch because he was busy or have a light snack. Dinner was veggies, rice, a little fish, and 2 nights a week he had 100 grams of lean meat. He would say, "Take the stairs, carry your own baggage, get a pet, and don't retire."
Let's wait and see how he is.
Approaching the age of 100, Dr. Denmark says she's about as busy now as she was when she started 7 decades ago.
She practiced till the age of 103 when her eyesight began to fail, but that was in 2001, and she was the oldest doctor on earth. And then she lived to be 114.
My mother helped develop whooping cough vaccine. This was, I think, one of the important things that she was involved with in her lifetime.
Dr. Denmark said in the early part of her career, she treated diseases like polio. But as her 70 years in practice rolled on, she found that the infants she treated were fed poorly. She said parents forgot how to feed themselves and their infants as the century progressed.
Just like these mothers, I'd say if you'll feed this baby right, keep it away from sick kids, you don't need me.
She believed every meal should have a little protein, either an egg, lean meat, black-eyed peas, or lentils. She ate an egg every day for breakfast. And she advised either whole grain or potato with every meal and vegetables with lunch and dinner. Dairy was overrated, she said, and no one should drink milk past 8 months. And she said food helps everything else go down, especially for kids. She thought a small sweet on Friday night and for dessert and Sunday supper gave the kids something to look forward to. I'm pretty sure the cause of death was she was 114.
If you'll eat right, drink right, and love to do what you're doing, there's no reason to die. All right, who's the next angel?
So 60 influencers on the timeline, some of them coming to their diets because of serious health problems like brain cancer, tuberculosis, or heart attacks. Let's see if patterns emerged. The first thing that jumps out at me is where the low carbers landed versus everyone else. That happened in the previous influencer episode too. I get the sense that low carb diets have degraded over the centuries. For example, here are fascinating cookbooks from 1797 and the Civil War era that you might want to get. They ate a much wider variety of animals than we do now, from little furry creatures to a large variety of birds. And they ate every part of the animal. These cookbooks are filled with recipes for tongue and apple pie, brains, and boiled pigeons. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to get your mouth watering. Now you're probably thinking about where to order brains. No worries, you can just one-click them frozen or canned from the everything store. The reviews say they are delicious. Here in 2020, our meats mainly come from monoculture animals raised on industrial farms. Plant-heavy diets, however, seem to have improved over the centuries. In most parts of the US and Europe, you can get fruit and veggies year-round, and even if you live in a food desert, there's usually frozen. There are new foods like quinoa and an insane variety of rices and beans. Vitamins B12 and D are super cheap now, and we're learning that even a significant number of animal food eaters need them. And perhaps even the juicers are taking things to the next level. And finally, these are centuries-old diets, marketed to sound new and revolutionary. For example, Thomas Treon's book, The Way to Health, which inspired Benjamin Franklin to become vegetarian, was published in 1681. Luigi Carnaro's book, Sure and Certain Methods of Attaining a Long and Healthful Life, was written in 1563 and popular for 2 centuries more. It sure sounded to me like as low-carb a book as Banting's. He had some bread, but not fruit and vegetables, except wine. After the book was published, he was said to narrow his eating to just eggs. By the way, a nun who wrote the appendix said a little fainting fit took him, which sounds like it could have been a heart attack, no? What none of these diets had faced before is what hamburger lover Bill Gates is claiming we have to do to avoid a climate disaster. He and naturalist Sir David Attenborough are saying we no longer have a choice. We have to switch to plant-based meat.
Yeah, I've seen a lot out here in the West. But a juicy charbroiled burger with a patty made from plants?
Lucky for us, plant-based meat has become so much better tasting lately, and it's only going to keep getting better. Also lucky for us, early studies seem to be showing that they're a little bit better for us than real meat. Wow, that was a long episode, and you're still watching? Thank you so much. I hope you'll like and subscribe whether you're watching on Plant-Based News or Plant Chompers. Also, I'd love it if you left a comment in either place. I read them all and learn a ton from you guys, and I respond to as many as possible.
Έτοιμοι.
As Sarah mentioned, I'm a surgeon. I do general and trauma surgery, and I work in the ICU. But my PhD work is in nutrition. And so it's been an interesting run of 35 years now of bringing nutrition sort of back to a surgical practice. The concept of where I really work is a concept of getting people tuned up prior to esophagectomy or pancreatectomy or big operations. And it's also allowed me to work on several things. I do a lot of international work. We work in Chiang Rai, Thailand, and then Laos, and Vientiane, Laos, on several big projects with rice and several things. So I've had been very lucky in my career to be able to work on this concept of good nutrition, changing things, changing outcome, changing cognitive function, and then come back to a clinical setting and work at medical college or at the Oregon Health Sciences, where I work in Portland. So, if we look at our global health challenges, they're really tremendous. I mean, really, but it revolves a lot about this concept of inflammatory disease. We're looking here. And really, if we look at the diseases other than the communicable diseases, which we see overseas, we're looking at cardiovascular disease, cancer, chronic respiratory disease, etc. And those are big burdens. I mean, they're huge. I think this quote by Napoleon very well. He says, the winner of the war will be able to control, the winner of the battle will be able to control chaos. And really, our approach currently is chaos. We've got government that doesn't really regulate much, especially in the last few years. They take away a lot of the things that get put in our foods. There's a lot of craziness. I mean, for years we've been having policies that hasn't really fit with the nutritional aspect. I mean, we give billions of dollars to healthcare, but we don't really address what's the bottom line to the disease. We're not addressing the inflammatory process. With our education, we know it works. If we start teaching kids as the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, they'll take in that message. And it's worked, and we've seen that work. And that's a lot of what I'm doing now at the end of my career, is trying to get these programs into schools so we can teach these kids and start from day one with progress. But again, we look at inflammatory states, obesity, cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, etc. all start. If we look at this slide's very interesting. It shows nicely what's happened here. All the infectious diseases have tremendously dropped. Okay, this is clearly not just 50 years ago, but this is starting at about 1950 to 2000. TB, hepatitis, rheumatic fever, measles, mumps, all coming down because of immunizations and a public policy which affects those. But look at our inflammatory diseases going up, almost paralleling, in fact, about 10 years preceding what we recognize as our obesity crisis. So I think inflammation then is the root to many of these things. And as you know, this is not new. John Hunter, famous biologist and anatomist from London in 1794, showed us that inflammation has many diseases associated with many diseases. A couple of years old, we realized the connection. So I think that's the issue. So if we look at diseases associated with inflammation, it's tremendous. So, you can see this big issue is virtually everything we deal with on a day-to-day basis in a clinical setting is inflammatory disease. I mean, even as a surgeon, we don't deal much with infectious disease anymore, except for necrotizing fasciitis, which rarely comes in once or twice a week, and that's about it. But so what's the driving force? I mean, what is it? What can we treat? I think we have to think about the GI tract as the main source. Okay, so if we think about, I like to think of the GI tract as sort of like just a tube going through us, kind of like a river going down through us, right? But not only that, like the skin that has to protect us from the outside environment, from the toxins we see and the things we put on our skin, but it also has to selectively absorb nutrients. So it has a bigger problem. It has to absorb some things without taking in the toxins. So it has to keep out the bad stuff and take in the good stuff. And so there's enough endotoxin in just one person in this room to kill all of us. So that's how efficient our gut is. I mean, that one cell layer thick, that we see down there on the brush border in the area out here, is basically keeping us from dying because of the endotoxin in our GI tract. And that's produced by the bacteria, produced by the purified E. coli endotoxins, et cetera, that we see every day. We use clinically to induce a hyperdynamic state. So I think about what the GI tract. So we're walking a thin line.
Yes.
We're walking that tightrope basically between barrier function, symbiosis, homeostasis, which is we like, to permeability and dysbiosis and inflammation. So I think that's why very little change, in our microbiome and the bacteria can make that difference. So I like to think of the gut as orchestrating the inflammatory response. Because when you start reading and drilling down on this, it really is. I mean, if we think about that, we've got G protein receptors here that respond to metabolites in bacteria. We've got dendritic cells here that go out and sample the environment of what's going on and tell the immune system what to do. Basically comes back and regulates the T cell. The T cell regulates the B cells. We know that these basically the muscularis layer is altered by what's happening in the bowel. We see this every day in the clinical setting, which once we've disrupted the bowel and done surgery, we know we alter the mechanical ability to peristalsis. So really, we have to think of the gut as changing. We also now know the association between the brain and the central nervous system. I mean, the gut-brain axis is a huge push now. And where did this all start? Well, it's actually fairly new. 1977 was this paper by Ben Eisman, University of Colorado, a surgeon who said, maybe the gut is the source of multiple organ failure. Before 1970, we all said, it's just the beginning of my surgical training, we all said it's related basically to infection. And all these people dying, they were dying of infection. And then Ben started with the concept of maybe it's multiple organ failure related to this uncontrolled inflammatory response. Not necessarily infection, although we spent the next 20 years going through papers that would say there's inflammation, but we never could isolate the bacteria. Remember that in your colon, you've got several thousand different species, or at least 1,500 different species in the U.S., of which only about 800 or so are culturable. So we're not able to culture them until we got the more modern techniques. We didn't really know. So we had all these people with these things, germ-free animals don't respond the same. So maybe there's something going on with the bacteria living in our gut. And so then we start saying, well, what about the microbiome? And this group, as you can see, is almost identical to the previous one. Inflammation, diseases related. Microbiome changes, diseases related, and they're almost identical. We get parallel. So let's look back at this history of this concept of microbiome, okay? So Metchnikoff really is sort of the father of our current concept of microbiome. Metchnikoff won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for the discovery of the macrophage, okay? And then he took his money that he won the Nobel Prize with, and he decided his interest was to why do certain populations in the world live longer in small villages, segments of different cultures, live longer than the surrounding villages? So Bulgaria is where he originally worked. So he went to the Yucatan Peninsula and found a segment that lived 20 years longer than the rest of the area, people in the area. He went to which is now North Korea, Korean Peninsula, found a segment of people that lived longer, and he studied 5 different segments around the world. He wrote an interesting paper in 1907. He said that the only thing they have in common was all of these cultures that live, groups that live a little longer than everybody else in their culture, all took daily fermented foods. So in North Korea, it was kimchi. In Yucatan Peninsula, it was fermented llama milk. Okay, in Bulgaria, it was cow's milk. So they had a lactobacillus species intake on a daily basis. So that really got this whole concept started. In fact, he named Lactobacillus bulgaricus which was the first lactobacillus species named, as you know, in the United States of America. Be called a yogurt, you've got to have Lactobacillus bulgaricus by definition. So that's followed us along. So we know then also that the surface area of the GI tract is about the size of a tennis court. So literally, if we take out our intestine, we lay it out, we take all the microvilli, spread them out, they're about the surface area of this room. And you can imagine that exposure, well, it takes a little bit of toxin in an area like that. Man, we know there's 8 million bacterial genes and about 20,000 human genes, and our different parts of our body have a different microbiome specific, whether it's the skin or the oral pharynx or whatever, you know. And we have about 1,000 species we can get by culture. A guy at University of California, Davis, spent his life culturing human stool. And in about 1985, he published a paper saying there's 750 species in the human stool. It took about 2 months to culture them all out, all the subspecies. I thought that was interesting, the poor guy. He did his own stool. I thought it was really strange when he put his kid's stool. You know, those poor kids, I feel, oh, Dad, not this rectal swabs again, you know. So when you start seeing that, you start, well, then we started seeing changes in our ability, based on some oceanography guys, we're able to non-culture by using 6NS ribosomal units. We can now say, we know we've got about 12 to 1,500 species. That could be argued maybe more, maybe less. We know that humans living in the United States have about 1,200, 1,300 species in our colon. If we go deep into the Amazon to a group that's never seen Western civilization, never had food that's, you know, done what's done to our food in our society, they have about 4,000 species. So the variety has decreased. That's one big issue. Variety is protective because there's redundancy. So the number of bacteria living in your colon helps us survive these perturbations, which we see normally through our routine daily life. Well, if you live deep in the jungle and you don't eat things in the Western society, we don't eat emulsifiers and pesticides and sweeteners and all these other things we do, we see the variety in your bacteria living in your colon are higher. Now, I'm not saying they live any longer than we do. In fact, they live shorter than we do. So I'm not saying it's all bad. So if we think about this concept of the microbiome, it came to us from Joshua Lederberg, another Nobel Prize winner, and he earned his Nobel Prize by describing how bacteria transfer genes and things like that. But he said, when we start talking about the human genetic machinery, the human genetic potential, we have to look at the whole story. That the bacteria, as you've seen in this conference, the bacteria living in your GI tract have epigenetic changes that will change on a day-to-day basis, that can change your genome expression, it can change your phenotypic expression, not the genome, but change your phenotypic expression of your genome through epigenetic changes. So we have to include the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses, and the archaea, which are sort of a halfway prokaryote, halfway eukaryote. So, if you look at that, what have we done in Western society? Change our lifestyle, sedentary lifestyle. Newborns, a third of our kids in this group, actually about 24% done in this country now, are born by C-section. Okay? Immunizations, domestic pets, parasitic infection, refrigeration. And now we get down here where we're starting to see changes, as you've seen in the earlier lectures, the way we process our foods, additive, emulsifiers, sweeteners, antioxidants, preservatives, insecticides. Great data coming out now on Roundup. Very interesting data, how it alters your microbiome. And it's in everything, okay? And then we increase use of antibiotics, whether they're indicated or not. We have good studies showing about 50% of the antibiotics given in this country on a routine basis are not indicated. There's no bacterial cultures found, but given because that's what the patients want. This is a good example here. This slide shows us what happens to Bifidobacteroides, one of these subspecies of Bacteroides, with a single dose of clindamycin, which obviously is good at killing anaerobe. Bacteroides is anaerobe. Look at this. They took here, day 0, the long-term effects of a 7-day course of clindamycin on Bacteroides. It takes almost a year to get that Bacteroides species back up to normal. A single dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics wipes out your normal flora. I know that when I give my patients pre-op antibiotics, I know I'm altering their flora. The worst is Cipro. We don't give it as a prophylactic antibiotic anymore because it's routinely known that that's gram for gram the highest cause. Cipro is the highest inducer of C. diff. Clostridium difficile caused 24,000 deaths in the United States in 2013. Death, 24,000 deaths. I take out a colon about probably 4 years ago, once a month for C. diff sepsis. Someone dying of C. diff sepsis, so I took out their whole colon. Now it's about, we're down because our hospital's way down on C. diff because of our probiotic protocol. I'll show you data for that. Well, I don't know if I have the data for that. So the microbiome, there's all kinds of good data, and again, I don't bore you with the details, but things like the average, by age 10, the average American's taken 10 courses of antibiotics. 50%